On the night of April 5th, 1453, in a vault beneath the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos gathered 3 men in absolute secrecy. The men he summoned were not his generals. They were not his bishops. They were bankers. Outside the church walls, 80,000 Ottoman soldiers were setting up camp, their siege towers visible against the spring sky. Inside the vault, candlelight flickered across relics that had survived for 1,000 years. The Crown of Thorns, fragments of the true cross, gold censers older than most European kingdoms. Constantine had ruled the greatest city in Christendom for exactly 4 years. He was about to gamble everything it held sacred on a single financial instrument. The man who spoke first was named Paolo di Montaldo, a Genoese banker trapped in the besieged city. He proposed something that had never been attempted in the history of Christian finance. He would create bonds, backed not by future tax revenue, not by gold reserves, but by the holy relics themselves. The most sacred objects in Orthodox Christianity would become collateral for a loan. He called them the bonds of holy wisdom, named after the great cathedral above their heads. Buried in that midnight meeting was a decision that revealed the fatal flaw of every dying empire. When you run out of real wealth, you monetize faith itself. When you run out of gold, you sell salvation. When you run out of time, you make promises you cannot possibly keep. Paolo di Montaldo promised the bonds would save the city. He promised triple returns if Constantinople held. He promised that God himself would honor debts secured by his own relics. Every single one of those promises would be broken within 55 days. The Genoese and Venetian merchants inside the walls bought bonds worth 30,000 gold hyperpyra, equal to roughly 2 years of the entire Byzantine Empire's remaining annual revenue. Within 8 weeks, every single coin would be gone. The walls would fall, the empire would end, and the bonds would become worthless pieces of parchment in the hands of dead men. Let me take you back to understand how the richest empire in history came to sell its soul for one last desperate stand. Because this story does not start in 1453. It starts in 1204, 249 years earlier, when Constantinople experienced its first financial apocalypse. For 800 years, from the 6th century to the 14th century, Constantinople was the wealthiest city on earth. Its location was perfect, controlling the only water route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Every ship carrying grain, slaves, silk, and spices had to pass through Byzantine waters and pay Byzantine taxes. The Byzantine gold coin, called the solidus, was the dollar of the medieval world. It held the same weight and purity for over 700 years. Merchants in London, Baghdad, and Kiev all trusted it because it never changed. The empire's annual revenue in the year 150 of the Common Era was 14,500,000 solidi. By 215, it had grown to 22 million solidi. The system worked beautifully for centuries. Europe was poor and fragmented. Constantinople was rich and organized. The Byzantine treasury literally glittered with gold. But there was a problem built into the system. The empire only remained wealthy as long as it controlled trade routes. It only maintained its army as long as tax revenue flowed from prosperous provinces. It only commanded respect as long as its gold reserves backed its currency. Constantinople would lose all three within 2 centuries. In April of 1204, an army that was supposed to be liberating Jerusalem instead turned on Constantinople itself. Crusaders who had sworn oaths to fight Muslims were bribed by Venetian merchants to attack the richest Christian city in the world. For 3 days, they looted everything. The official accounting recorded 900,000 silver marks stolen, equivalent to 3,600,000 hyperpyra, or 50,000 pounds of gold. But that number does not include the countless icons melted down, ancient manuscripts burned for warmth, bronze statues destroyed. Some of those statues had been made in the time of Alexander the Great. The Crusaders did not just rob Constantinople. They killed it financially. When the Byzantines finally recaptured their city in 1261, Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos faced a problem. The treasury was empty. The Venetians, who had organized the Fourth Crusade, still controlled Byzantine trade. Michael needed allies, and he needed them immediately. So he made a deal with Genoa, Venice's bitter rival. In exchange for military support against Venice, Michael granted the Genoese their own quarter in Galata, directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople. He gave them the same tax privileges the Venetians once enjoyed. 4% customs duty instead of the 10% charged to Byzantine merchants. The deal worked in the short term. The Genoese navy helped crush Venetian power in Byzantine waters. But Michael had just planted a seed that would strangle his empire. By 1348, less than 90 years after the Genoese were granted Galata, something extraordinary had happened. Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Roman Empire, collected 30,000 hyperpyra in annual revenue. Galata, the Genoese merchant colony across the water, collected 200,000 hyperpyra. The colony was earning almost 7 times what the empire itself was earning. Byzantine emperors could watch from their palace windows as Genoese ships loaded with silk, grain, and slaves passed through waters the Byzantines supposedly controlled, paying taxes to Genoa instead of Constantinople. In 1343, 110 years before the final siege, Empress Anna of Savoy did something unthinkable. She pawned the Byzantine crown jewels to Venetian merchants for 30,000 Venetian ducats, equivalent to 60,000 hyperpyra. The crown itself, the physical symbol of imperial power, worn by emperors since Constantine the Great in the 4th century, was now held as collateral by foreign bankers. This was not a strategic decision. This was desperation. One man saw clearly what was happening and said so publicly. Demetrios Kydones, a Byzantine scholar and the most influential advisor to Emperor John V Palaiologos, wrote in 1369, and I quote, "We have become poorer than the meanest citizen of our former empire. We rule over a few square miles, and we flatter ourselves with memories of our ancient glory." Kydones argued that Byzantium needed to reform its currency, rebuild its tax system, and stop relying on mercenaries it could not afford. He was ignored. Byzantine emperors continued to devalue their coinage, hire expensive foreign soldiers, and pretend that Constantinople's ancient prestige could substitute for actual military power. The Byzantine gold coin had held the same purity for 700 years. By the 14th century, it had been debased so many times that merchants no longer trusted it. The hyperpyron, which once contained 4 grams of pure gold, now contained barely 1 gram. Foreign merchants demanded payment in Venetian ducats or Genoese florins. The Byzantine currency, once the global reserve currency, became worthless in its own markets. And still, the spending continued. Still, the mercenaries were hired. Still, Byzantine emperors acted as if they ruled an empire rather than a dying city-state. By the spring of 1453, everyone could see the end approaching. In 1430, Ottoman Sultan Murad II had besieged Constantinople but accepted a bribe to withdraw. In 1444, a crusade to save Byzantium was crushed at the Battle of Varna. In 1451, 19-year-old Mehmed II became Sultan and immediately announced his intention to take Constantinople. In 1452, Mehmed built a fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, directly threatening the city. By January 1453, Ottoman agents were openly recruiting engineers to build siege cannons. By March, those cannons were being tested within sight of Constantinople's walls. By April 5th, 80,000 soldiers were camped outside, and the final siege had begun. On the night of April 5th, hours after the Ottoman camp was established, Constantine XI gathered his closest advisors in the vault beneath Holy Wisdom. Present were Paolo di Montaldo, Genoese banker and merchant; Lucas Noturas, the Grand Duke and Chief Minister of the Empire; Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese mercenary captain who had just arrived with 700 soldiers; Leonard of Chios, the Archbishop of Lesbos, and papal representative. For 4 hours, they debated 3 options. Option 1. Send envoys to beg for more help from Western Europe. Lucas Notaras argued this was pointless. The Pope had demanded that Byzantium accept Catholic supremacy as the price for aid. Most Orthodox Christians would rather see the city fall than submit to Rome. Option 2. Attempt to bribe Mem to withdraw as his father had been bribed in 1430. Constantine had already tried this. Mem had responded by executing the Byzantine ambassadors. Option 3. Paolo di Montaldo's proposal. Create bonds backed by church treasures and relics. Sell them to the Genoese and Venetian merchants still trapped inside the walls. Use the gold to hire more mercenaries, repair the walls, and attempt to bribe Ottoman pashas to sabotage the siege from within. Constantine chose option 3 because he had no other choice. On April 7th, 2 days after the vault meeting, Constantine addressed the defenders from the wall near the gate of St. Romanos. He said, and I quote from the account of the Venetian surgeon Niccolò Barbaro, "God will not allow this city, which has been the light of orthodoxy for 1,000 years, to fall to the infidel. Those who fight with me will be rewarded in this life and the next." He did not mention the bonds. He did not mention that church treasures were being used as collateral for loans. He did not mention that his plan depended on foreign merchants prioritizing profit over escape. Constantine was lying through omission. He knew the city would likely fall. Everyone in that vault meeting knew it, but he needed the defenders to believe otherwise, or they would abandon the walls immediately. When faith runs out, leaders monetize hope itself. Here is how the bonds of holy wisdom actually worked. Each bond was denominated in 1,000 hyperpyra, roughly equal to the annual income of a prosperous merchant. The bonds promised triple returns if Constantinople held for 1 year. They were secured by specific relics held in holy wisdom. Bondholders would receive certificates listing which sacred objects backed their investment. The Crown of Thorns, the lance that pierced Christ, gold-encrusted gospel books. Paolo di Montaldo printed 200 bonds. He sold 114 of them in the first week. Who bought them? Genoese merchants who owned warehouses full of silk and grain they could not evacuate. Venetian traders who calculated that a triple return was worth the risk. Even some wealthy Orthodox families who believed God would protect investments backed by his own relics. Byzantine chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles later wrote that these buyers were men who loved gold more than God, but who convinced themselves that in buying the bonds they served both. Constantine spent the money as fast as it came in. 10,000 hyperpyra went to Giovanni Giustiniani to keep his 700 Genoese soldiers fighting. 8,000 went to repair the weakest sections of the Theodosian walls. 5,000 went to attempted bribes of Ottoman commanders, none of which worked. The rest went to food, gunpowder, and small payments to keep civilian defenders from deserting. Within 3 weeks, all 30,000 hyperpyra were gone, and the siege was just beginning. By early May, as the Ottoman siege towers drew closer and the walls began to crack under constant cannon fire, something predictable happened. Bondholders tried to sell. Owners of bonds backed by the Crown of Thorns offered them at 200 hyperpyra, an 80% loss. No buyers appeared. Owners of bonds backed by fragments of the True Cross offered them at 100 hyperpyra, a 90% loss. Still no buyers. By May 15th, with the Ottomans preparing for a final assault, the bonds were trading at 10 hyperpyra, a 99% loss. By May 25th, nobody would buy them at any price. The market for sacred bonds had evaporated completely. On May 23rd, 6 days before the fall, Orthodox Patriarch Gennadius Scalarius delivered a sermon inside Holy Wisdom. He denounced the bonds as blasphemy. He said, and I quote, "You cannot sell what belongs to God. You cannot make profit from the suffering of Christ. Those who bought these bonds bought not salvation, but damnation." This created an impossible situation. The bonds had funded the defense. Without them, the walls would have already fallen. But now the highest religious authority in the empire was declaring that the financial instrument that kept the city alive was actually a mortal sin. Defenders faced a moral paradox. They were fighting for a city that their own church said had already betrayed God. By late May, a group of Genoese bondholders realized that Constantinople would fall no matter what they did. They held bonds worth nominally 50,000 hyperpyra, now worthless. But they also had ships in the harbor and access to the sea walls. On May 27th, according to later Ottoman sources, 3 Genoese merchants approached Mehmed's camp under a flag of truce. They offered to open the harbor gate in exchange for safe passage for themselves, their families, and their warehouses full of goods. Mehmed agreed. On the night of May 28th, those merchants did not open the gate. Either they lost their nerve or the conspiracy was discovered. But the fact that bondholders were negotiating with the enemy showed that financial collapse destroys loyalty faster than military defeat. On the morning of May 29th, 1453, Ottoman forces breached the walls near the gate of St. Romanos. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese mercenary captain, was wounded and carried to a ship, destroying the morale of his soldiers. Constantine XI removed his imperial regalia, drew his sword, and charged into the breach. He was never seen again. His body was never identified. By noon, Ottoman soldiers were inside holy wisdom itself. They found the relics that backed the bonds. They found the Crown of Thorns. They found the fragments of the true cross. They found centuries of accumulated sacred treasures. Mehmed claimed them all as spoils of war. In the vault beneath holy wisdom, Ottoman soldiers found something else. Stacks of printed bond certificates. Elaborate parchments with wax seals listing which relics secured which debts. Promises of triple returns. The soldiers used them as kindling to light torches. The bonds of holy wisdom, which were supposed to save the empire, burned in the vault of the church they were named after. Now here is the part that should keep you awake at night. Everything that destroyed Byzantium is happening again in our financial system right now. The same pattern, the same mistakes, the same desperate monetization of things that should not be monetized, and the same promises that this time will be different. It will not be different. In 1453, Byzantium created bonds backed by religious relics. In 2008, American banks created bonds backed by home mortgages, including the mortgages of people who could never afford to repay them. Both systems took something with emotional or social value and turned it into a tradable financial instrument. Both systems assumed the underlying asset would hold value forever. Both systems collapsed when that assumption proved false. The American housing bubble destroyed $8 trillion in wealth in 18 months. The Byzantine bond bubble destroyed a 1,000-year empire in 55 days. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire had spent decades living beyond its means, financing wars and programs it could not afford. Today, the United States has a national debt of $36 trillion, equal to roughly 120% of gross domestic product. Byzantium devalued its currency repeatedly rather than cutting spending. The United States has printed trillions of dollars since 2008 rather than reducing deficits. Byzantium's annual revenue in 1348 was 30,000 hyperpyra, while the Genoese colony across the water collected 200,000. Today, the United States collects $4 trillion in annual tax revenue, while paying more than $1 trillion per year just in interest on the debt. The numbers are different. The pattern is identical. Byzantine bonds were backed not by tax revenue or gold reserves, but by faith that God would protect the city. Modern sovereign debt is backed not by physical assets, but by faith that governments will always be able to tax or print enough money to repay. In both cases, when faith collapsed, so did the entire system. The Byzantine Empire fell in a single day. The housing market collapsed in a single quarter. The next crisis will arrive just as suddenly. By May of 1453, wealthy Genoese merchants were negotiating with Mehmed while publicly claiming loyalty to Constantine. Today, central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. Billionaires are buying farmland and hard assets. Sovereign wealth funds are diversifying out of dollar-denominated bonds. The people who understand how these systems work are positioning themselves for what comes next. They're not telling you what they see. They are quietly preparing. There were two types of people in Constantinople in April of 1453. Type 1. Those who believed Constantine's promises and Paolo di Montaldo's bond prospectus. They stayed in the city. They bought bonds promising triple returns. They believed God and gold would save them. On May 29th, most of them died. The survivors lost everything they owned. Type 2. Those who saw the Ottoman camp of 80,000 soldiers and made their own calculations. 7 Italian ships slipped out of the harbor the night Justiniani arrived. 700 men who had sworn to defend Constantinople chose survival over honor. History calls them cowards, but they lived. Giovanni Justiniani, the great mercenary captain, fought brilliantly for 7 weeks. When he was wounded on May 29th, he demanded to be carried to his ship rather than die on the walls. He survived the battle, but died of his wounds 3 days later on the island of Chios. He kept his honor and lost his life. The Italian deserters lost their honor and kept their lives. Constantine XI kept both his honor and his throne and lost everything. Which choice was correct? History does not answer that question. You face the same choice right now. How much of your wealth is in assets that depend on promises from institutions that are drowning in debt? How much is in government bonds from countries with debt-to-GDP ratios above 100%? How much is in currencies that have lost 98% of their purchasing power over the past 50 years? If the system that Constantine trusted collapsed in 55 days, how long do you think you have? Do you believe that this time is different? Do you believe that governments can print unlimited money without consequences? Do you believe that debts that can never be repaid somehow do not matter? Constantine believed all of those things. So did every Byzantine emperor before him. They were all wrong. On May 29th, 1453, the last Roman emperor died, defending walls that could not be defended, backed by bonds that could not be honored, trusting in relics that could not save him. His empire had survived for 1,123 years, longer than any empire in human history. It fell in a single day because its financial system had been dying for 2 centuries and nobody wanted to admit it. I am not telling you that the American financial system will collapse tomorrow. I'm telling you that the pattern is identical. I'm telling you that the warning signs are everywhere. I'm telling you that the smart money is already moving. The bonds of holy wisdom burned in a vault beneath a conquered church in 1453. Your retirement account, your savings, your pension are backed by promises just as empty as those bonds were. The question is not whether you believe me. The question is whether you are paying attention to the pattern. History is warning us. Are you listening?